So intercultural communication is a field that's been through some evolution. In the old days, we used to talk to people about how to communicate better across cultures. Cultures taken frequently in the national sense, but sometimes in more specific senses, such as organizational culture. Last night I was talking with the ambassador from Norway. Is he here? No? I was talking about being in Italy, and so we started talking about things Norwegian and things Italian. And I was telling him once I was asked to consult to an organization of Norwegians that were having a difficult time with the Italians, and vice versa. The Italians thought the Norwegians were rather abrupt. The Norwegians thought the Italians were rather talkative. And as part of my work, of course, we interview people, and part of my interview is to ask about the ritual use of language, things like greeting rituals and leave-taking rituals. And when I asked the Norwegians, how do you come to an end of a conversation, they said, well, you just stop. And what do you do then? Well, you walk away. You know? What about if you're on the phone, you hang up? If any of you know Italians, you know that isn't generally the case amongst Italians. It takes about 15 minutes to come towards the end of the conversation. And then even at the end, people don't just say ciao and walk away. You know, they say ciao, 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 ciao. And, so I live in a flat where the elevator doors are just outside the door of the flat. And it's rather an art when Italian visitors are coming for the last ciao to occur, just as the doors come shut like that. Even on the phone, you'll see people, rather than just saying ciao, click, they'll go ciao, 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 and move the phone away from their mouths so that the person on the other end hears it tapering off. Right? Yeah. So actually, this turned out to be a pretty interesting piece for the organization, and I think it probably helped them to become aware of some of the bases of the problems that they were having. Now, there are some dangers in what I've just been telling you as well, right? First of all, even though I've been rather careful in saying some people and tend to, the possibility of stereotyping is within this kind of approach. That is, if you're Italian, you must talk a lot. And I'm sure all of you know some Italian who's rather taciturn. Or if you're Norwegian, you must not talk a lot, and perhaps you know somebody who does. So, in fact, these generalizations that we make about culture are not meant to apply to individuals, but frequently it's taken that way. The other thing is that it is rather trivial. I mean, this is not really addressing some of the basic issues of intercultural relations. So, one of the reasons for forming this research institute was to try to back up and to look at what's going on at a deeper level. So what I'd like to do is to suggest that there is an underlying epistemology, an underlying set of assumptions, which is either aiding us or impeding us in our ability to do some of the things that we heard so reasonably and interestingly suggested, I think, earlier this morning. So I will move into a very quick introduction based on the idea of that the globe is not melting, trying to draw attention to the old stereotype, or the old myth anyway, of the melting pot. This was a play, by the way, from 1927 in the US. That's where the term melting pot came from, Israel Zangwill. One of the lines in that play is, "Bring me your many peoples of Europe with their 50 languages and their 50 histories, and we will melt them down in God's crucible, the great melting pot, out of which will emerge a new super race of beings, the Americans." I think you recognize that idea was picked up by some Europeans later on in the century. But it's not that this idea has gone away. Now we see this in the name of convergence, that somehow when you bring people together, they just naturally will converge. They'll discover their common humanity, and things will be okay. Now, I didn't hear a lot of examples of that in the discussion this morning. I was pleased to hear. I believe that more likely in this group anyway, there is a clear recognition that more globalization, more migration, more mobility means more diversity. Should you wonder about that, there's a really nice study from Geert Hofstede, who studied 31 different national groups within IBM, which has a rather strong corporate culture, and outside of IBM, his hypothesis was that the people inside IBM would report themselves to be more similar to one another because of the influence, the convergence influence of the corporate culture compared to their compatriots outside of IBM. And he found the opposite. He found that the people inside IBM from those 31 different national groups reported themselves to be more different from one another than the people outside, than the compatriots outside, which I think creates a parallel to what's going on in societies. Here's the statement from Marshall McLuhan, who coined the term global village, 1964, who said, he didn't say in the global village we're all going to be the same. He said in the global village our neighbors will be profoundly different from us. Our neighbors, meaning they're not going to be over there, they're going to be here, or on the phone, or on the internet. So this is the world, I think we all agree, that we are inevitably moving towards, to note one of the other comments from this morning. Here's a little piece of another piece of corporate research that I thought is kind of interesting. This is a compilation of a lot of work on multicultural teams. And the idea here is that you take a monocultural team, people who are largely similar to one another, and give them a creative task, like how many ways can you use a brick? And then their performance is listed as average. Then you mix up the teams. So you create gender diversity, national culture, socioeconomic class, all kinds of diversity. And then you give them the same task. Again and again, we have found that the multicultural teams either outperform or underperform the monocultural teams. So within this is the dirty secret of diversity, of the value of diversity, which is it could be a disvalue. That diversity does cause trouble. It does cause problems. People are impeded in their ability to get along with one another if they don't share a language, when they don't share values, etc. On the other hand, it points to what people frequently call the value of diversity, which is more innovation, more generativity. What's the difference? And these studies show that if the leader acknowledges and supports cultural difference, the leader of the group now, and then cultural difference is likely to become an asset to performance. If, on the other hand, the leader suppresses the cultural difference, usually in the name of the corporate culture, and says, we're all IBM here, therefore we don't need to worry about our differences because we're all moving in the same direction, we're all on the same page. In that case, the difference doesn't go away, it becomes an obstacle to performance. So I think there's a lesson for us here in societies from this corporate research. Here's a statement from the business world, Rosabeth Moss Kanter, in the 21st century, all companies will have access to global resources. Or read, all societies will be experiencing diversity. The companies that will thrive are those that learn how to turn access into an asset. In other words, all of us are going to be in the vicinity of diversity. The question is, will that become an asset or not? And of course, the rhetorical question is, are societies like corporations in this regard? And I think, yes, they are. So many years ago, I formulated a model. This is this model that was referred to earlier by David, of how people get better at doing this. And it's called a model of perceptual experience of difference. It's based on expert models in general. If you're a wine connoisseur, for instance, you have learned how to hone your perception of wine or chocolate or whatever it is that you're an expert in, music, so that you can make distinctions that people who are not experts in that area can't make. In other words, you have a deeper perceptual structure, basically, for that. And so based on that idea, I developed this notion of moving from ethnocentrism, where you see your culture as being central to reality, to ethno-relativism, where you see that reality could be defined in different ways. Your culture happens to define it in a particular way. This moves from the idea of denial, which is the failure to perceive cultural differences at all. It's like there's something out there, but I'm not quite sure what it is. To defense, which is now I know what it is and they're coming to take our jobs. To minimization, which is, oh, but we're all human beings after all, kumbaya, we are the world, and which is what you get the Nobel Peace Prize for, is moving from here to here. The problem is that this is an unstable condition. This is still an ethnocentric condition. I have never heard anybody say everybody in the world is the same and they're all like her. No, you're all like me. So what I'm really doing is projecting my categories on the rest of the world and saying deep down everybody's human like me. So it's ethnocentric. That means that it's not very stable, and it doesn't take much to move from minimization back to defense. All you need to have is a somewhat articulate demagogue to move people back. You thought those other people were human, but they're really not. But the stage on the other side of this line is acceptance. And by acceptance, I don't mean agreement. I mean the ability to accept that other people are having a significantly different experience of reality than you are. And this is understanding the equal complexity, the difference but the equal complexity of the other. And it's based on that we're able to adapt our behavior, not just me adapting to you, but you adapting to me, and a mutual adaptation that I'll mention in a moment. And that in turn sets up the title of this conference, which I define as the ability to include cultural context in our decision making and the ability to act with contextual commitment, ethical commitment. Ethics, I think ethicality is not talked about as much as it should be in this context, because if we really want to be respectful of others, we need to figure out how to be respectful of how other people are defining good in a way differently than we are, and not just to dismiss that and say you have to follow our values. We need to figure out some other more sophisticated way of coordinating our values. Now, this is pretty straightforward. There's actually been a lot of research that supports this. It's held up. This was first published in 1986. So in the academic field, we call this a robust theory. But I think many of you will agree that it doesn't look like we are speeding along this continuum. In fact, we tend to kind of keep cycling here a lot. Why is that? And it's that question that I'd like to address for the next few minutes here this afternoon. And that's based on the idea that there are some underlying paradigms, some knowledge paradigms, essentially an epistemological position that underlies these different conditions that I'm modeling here. On the first one is positivism, which comes out of a Newtonian sort of worldview, the notion that there is a one reality out there and I know what it is. Relativism, which came in as a counter to that, saying, well, there may be a reality out there, but we can only have our perception of it. And then finally, Constructivism, which is much more related to more of a quantum view in physics, which has to do with the interaction of the observer and that which is being observed, a co-ontological position. I'll say more about that in a moment. So starting with this Newtonian paradigm, and this is based on the notion that social science tends to borrow from physical science, that what they're doing is looking for how it is that physical scientists are dealing with the world, and then they try to emulate that. That's the term, social science. But there's a lag. So even though physical scientists haven't really been dealing with Newtonian physics for like close to 100 years, nevertheless, social science continues in many ways to try to emulate Newtonian physics in the form of positivism. Reality exists as it is, looking in the same direction. Every observer sees the same thing. It's the notion, the myth, really, of objectivity. Now, as you know, people in this room, probably very few of you would say, oh yes, there's an objective reality that we all can see if we look in the same direction. But in everyday life, this continues to be an important idea. And when we have that idea, once again, I think a relatively obscure implication of this is that the idea of culture really can't exist, because insofar as culture represents a different experience of the world, a different kind of reality, those realities are either mistaken or wrong. They're not alternative ways of experiencing the world. So different forms of civilization are just better or worse variations on this single reality. Thus, we have the hierarchy of civilization. On the top are the civilized people, who, of course, are the people who created this model. And then the barbarians, who are the people who could be civilized with help. Usually that means colonization, or as we call it in the US these days, or used to recently, nation building. And then down here are the savages that I'm sorry to say are not really as human as the other people, and it's okay to exploit them. And while this drove slavery, the institution of slavery, I think you can see that it continues to drive a lot of behavior yet today. In fact, if we are to list the kinds of things that go along with this, the old idea of social Darwinism, that somehow the more fit people percolate to the top of this, that rich people are rich because they deserve to be rich, and that's why they should get more tax breaks. And or teleological modernity, that's the modernity, of course, is this post-Enlightenment notion that we are moving in a trajectory towards a more perfect future. The end of history, basically. Neoliberalism, currently in vogue, and populism, which I like to put with a little slash next to fascism. So then the next paradigm, the Einsteinian paradigm, which the physicists have been using, of course, for a long time, makes the assumption that many of you share in here, which is we can't talk about an absolute reality. We can only talk about our perception of reality. We can talk about our position relative to reality, thus the notion of subjectivity. When we say that, then we have to understand civilization in terms of its own perspective, and that, of course, is the basis of cultural relativism. So cultural relativism is the idea that we cannot apply an absolute standard, but instead we have to understand A in terms of A, B in terms of B, C in terms of C, and so forth. Sounds good, right? We created this against this hierarchy of civilization precisely for the idea of affirming the goodness of other social organizations in the world. So basically an anthropological idea. The problem is that we also created a lack of communication. We also created the inability for people from A to communicate with B. In other words, we created the conditions for the echo chamber, the conditions for us to only be around other people who are like us. And while you may disagree with that in the general way, think of all of the times that we say to people, particularly if you're a critical theorist, when you say to somebody, you can't really understand another person unless you are one of them. Or this is particularly true if you are a person of the dominant group. You can't understand somebody from a non-dominant group because you haven't had that experience in the world. The idea of cultural appropriation, which is somehow trying to understand something in another culture, but not being a member of that culture, means that you are exercising some kind of neo-colonialist approach. These are all ideas that emerge from this basic idea of cultural relativism. So on the one hand, relativism is generating the ability for us to see other cultures in relatively non-evaluative ways, at least not in this way here. But at the same time, it's creating a division. It's creating the seeds of exactly the condition that we are living in at this moment, which is the inability for us to communicate with one another, the increasing fragmentation of our experience. So much of diversity and multiculturalism, postmodern critical theory has been supporting the extension of this into a position of extreme relativism. And I would say pretty much here's where we are now. Having shifted, and here I'm trying to make a bit of a media connection as well, having shifted from the Newtonian or universalist paradigm where facts exist objectively, we've shifted over into the Einsteinian paradigm where facts are selected according to your perspective, and necessarily so, that there's nothing else you can do but select facts according to your perspective. But look at the implications of this. Thus, a factual dispute here is about the truth of the matter, as defined objectively. Here, the factual dispute is a clash of narratives. How often have we heard that recently? A clash of narratives. We need to have a narrative, a counter-narrative that comes from this view here. Argument seeks to garner the best, most objective evidence. No, argument is appropriately the manipulation of facts to generate a more powerful narrative. And consequently, news should be objective and only editorially subjective to news is necessarily subjective, and once we assume that, we have fake news and real news. Essentially, the real news is the one we agree with, and the fake news is the one we don't. Now, you can apply other standards, but what you do is you come back into the standard of objectivity, which philosophically has more or less been rejected for the purpose of generating respect for other groups. You see, we've worked ourselves into a conundrum here, or I would call it a paradigmatic confusion, where on the one hand we want the advantages of one paradigm, the respect for others coming from relativism, but the only way that we can communicate with one another is in terms of the positivism, or a reference back to an objective reality. Well, obviously I won't stop at this point, okay? I think that there are some other things we can be doing which are relatively less well-formed. Oh, here's a little demonstration of that. That was Brad with the Democratic weather. Now here's Tammy with the Republican weather. So the quantum paradigm in physics, which has been around now competing with the Einsteinian paradigm for most of the last 3/4 of a century, is now to a greater extent being picked up in social science. And the underlying assumption of this paradigm, or constructivism, is the idea that reality that we live in is a co-construction. It's a co-ontological construction, that the observer is neither an objective observer nor simply a subjective perspective, but rather a co-creator of the reality. And I won't go into the physics experiments that support this, but I'm sure that you're aware that there are many, many experiments now in physics which depend on the way in which the observer or the experimenter sets up the experiment, and that's co-creating essentially the phenomenon that is thus seen. So culture then becomes both the collective process of constructing this reality and its product. So here's a constructivist definition of culture. The big C culture on this side over here are the institutions, that is, the things that people have created. It's pronounced culture, as in let's go out and do something cultural tonight, right? I think you know what I mean. On the other side of the small c culture, this is the worldview, the experience that people are having. We are socialized into a big C culture, but we support that big C culture with our role enactment. This leads to a definition of culture which I would suggest can lead us out of that conundrum that we were talking about. The coordination of meaning and action amongst people interacting within a boundary. Culture then is not a thing, it's something we're doing. We are coordinating. One way to look at when we're coordinating within boundaries. So the boundaries might be national boundaries, but they could be boundaries of ethnic heritage. They could be combinations of ethnic and national boundaries. They could be combinations of national and sub-regional. They could be combinations of national and super-regional. This is particularly important for the EU, of course. Or they could be other categories, age, class, sexual orientation, and so forth. In other words, the boundary condition is co-constructed. The boundary condition does not have an a priori existence. It's something that we are engaged in constructing, and thus we can construct it in multiple ways. There is absolutely no reason from this paradigm why we ought not to be operating with multiple cultural identities. A national identity, an ethnic identity, a regional identity, and so forth. So intercultural communication becomes, I apologize for the term, a meta-coordination. So you have culture A here, you have culture B here, and we have the need to coordinate across coordinating systems. We don't want to get rid of, let me go back here. We don't want to get rid of this culture here. Right. We don't want to get rid of culture A because that's part of diversity. We don't want to get rid of culture B because that's part of diversity. But we need to have a way to coordinate across A and B that doesn't subject it back to the absolute standard of an objective reality. And that's the meta-coordination, the construction of meaning across meaning construction systems, basically. There are two keys to doing this, and I'll briefly tell you what they are. One of them is the reconciliation of unity and diversity. And these frequently are in competition with one another, as we know politically. If unity wins, which it usually does, you get uniformity. If diversity wins, which it sometimes does, you get divisiveness. In other words, these two poles of a dichotomy, when you pull them apart, tend to generate extreme conditions. The only way to get the advantage of the value of diversity is to reconcile unity and diversity. And when you do that, every time you think about unity, you think about diversity. Every time you think about diversity, you think about unity. You get focus from the unity, and you get innovation from the diversity. This focused innovation. I've shown this to like thousands of executives, and so far, not one of them has disagreed with that. And I suspect you don't either. I mean, this is what we see as the value of a multicultural society, is the potential for focused innovation. But we don't get there unless we change our underlying epistemology, unless we change our underlying assumptions about how reality works, I'm afraid. The other thing is, who does the adaptation? Do they adapt to us? Do we adapt to them? Or is it some sort of vague other thing? And while this is a not particularly well-formed idea, it's the beginning of this notion that when culture A adapts to an organization and culture B adapts as well to the organization, including each other, it generates a virtual third culture position. Virtual meaning that it comes into existence in the process of the interaction. It doesn't have an independent existence. And it's out of that third culture that value comes to the organization. That value does not come to the society or organization because A is around. In fact, that could be a disvalue. What creates the value is the adaptation of A and B to each other. That's what generates the value. And thus, the conclusion of my remarks. If you're interested in more of this, there's a text that more or less follows what I've been telling you called The Value of Cultural Diversity, Rhetoric, and Reality. That's available as a download from that website. There's a book I did, and that's the end. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We do have time for one or two very short questions from the audience, because Dr. Bennett will not be sitting on the panel. So if you have a question, speak now.
Speak now,
there
forever
you go.
hold your peace. Yes.
Can you give us an example of a country maybe that has kind of succeeded in what you have presented?
No.
Ooh, I like this. We could almost get three questions.
But I can give you some examples of smaller scale projects that I think move in this direction. I had some research, a student do some research in Finland on social services in Finland, and what she was looking at is the extent to which this mutual adaptation process was intentionally being set up in that Finnish social service agency, where the social service workers were saying, here's how we're adapting to you, and we're being very explicit about that, and saying, and how is it that you're adapting to us, with the goal not of getting them to take on Finnish values, so much as to generate a third culture position that was reasonably acceptable to both sides. And I thought it was an interesting example of where we might be going in that regard anyway.
So Finland.
Well, I'm not sure I go so far as to say Finland, but okay, yeah, but that's where that piece of research occurred, yeah.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. Alexandra Lalika from Tallinn University. My question is how to move from this model of intercultural sensitivity to this meta-coordination model?
I think that probably I can't do it, can I? But if you think back to that developmental model, and you know that I had the positivism on the first three ethnocentric stages, then the relativism was kind of the transition, and then the integration was associated with constructivism. I think the shift into the kind of integration that we're talking about here is pretty much dependent on making that paradigm shift. It's dependent on our changing our epistemological assumptions about the way reality works. And I think that that's likely to be happening anyway following Thomas Kuhn's idea of the structure of scientific revolution and what happens when paradigms come to the end of their usefulness, they change into a new one. We're probably at that point in social science anyway. However, it's a very, very messy time, and those of us who are thinking about this systematically, I think, can probably bring more coherence to that transition by being aware of this and doing some things that actively facilitate it.
Thank you very much. And he will be chairing one of the workshops this afternoon. So if you're lucky enough to be in his, then you can continue with any other questions that you might have.
You notice I haven't mentioned Donald Trump once, but I will this afternoon. Yeah, okay. All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.